For thousands of years, the Chinese have believed that the moment you are born shapes the entire arc of your life. Not your star sign, not your personality, the precise elemental forces in motion at the exact second you took your first breath. I am Mr. Shu. I read those forces for a living. On this channel, I take the classical system of BaZi and apply it to the questions people are actually asking: career decisions, relationships, whether the difficulty you are experiencing right now is temporary or structural, whether the opportunity in front of you is real or a distraction. No vague monthly forecasts, no items to purchase, just the system applied honestly. Today, we are breaking down the luck decade system, how to read it, what it actually predicts, and why two people with similar charts can have completely different decades. Let us get into it. Think about someone you know who had a real turning point, not a gradual shift, a real one. A year, maybe two, where everything changed direction. A new career that actually held. A relationship that finally worked. Financial progress that had been stuck for years suddenly moving. Or the reverse. Someone who seemed to be doing well and then quietly, over the course of a couple of years, everything started going sideways. The job, the money, the confidence. Most people explain this as luck, or hard work, or timing. BaZi has a more precise answer. Every person's life runs in 10-year chapters. The classical Chinese system calls these dayun. The direct translation is major luck. Each chapter carries its own elemental energy, and that elemental energy either supports the person or it works against them. The turning points people describe, the ones that feel like the entire texture of their life shifted overnight, in most cases they were standing at the edge of a new chapter and did not know it. That is what we are looking at today. Before we can talk about luck decades, we need to be clear about what the birth chart does and what it does not do. Your BaZi birth chart is constructed from the year, month, day, and hour you were born. 4 pillars, 8 characters. That is where the name comes from. 4 pillars of destiny. The chart shows you the elemental makeup of your life, your natural strengths, the type of wealth your chart is structured to accumulate, the type of relationships that align with your energy, the career structures that suit how you are fundamentally wired. What the birth chart does not tell you is when. This is the part most people miss. A chart might clearly show someone has a strong wealth structure, a genuine path to financial stability. But the chart alone cannot tell you whether that wealth arrives at 30, at 45, or later. It cannot tell you which decade the conditions are actually in place to make it happen. The luck decade system is what fills that gap. It is the timing layer that sits over the birth chart. Think of it this way. The birth chart is the land. The luck decades are the weather. You can have fertile land. But if the weather does not cooperate at the right time, nothing grows. And you can have difficult land. But with the right weather at the right moment, you can still produce something meaningful. The land does not change. The weather moves through in chapters. And some chapters are better than others for what your particular land is able to grow. Every person enters their first luck decade at a specific age. That starting age is different for every person. It is calculated from the birth chart itself, based on the gap between your birth date and the nearest solar term in the Chinese calendar. Some people begin their first major luck cycle at age 4, others at age 7 or 9 or even later. The number varies. After that starting point, a new chapter opens every 10 years, then the next, and the next, throughout the person's entire life. Each decade is represented by two characters, a stem and a branch. The stem is the surface layer of that decade. It governs what you encounter in the outside world during those 10 years, the nature of the opportunities that appear, the type of people who come into your life, the visible conditions around you. The branch is the layer operating underneath the surface. It shapes your internal experience, your drive, and your state of mind. The structural pressures or supports running beneath everything visible. Both are active at the same time, but they operate on different levels. And skilled readers will look at both because sometimes the surface is smooth while the foundation is unsettled. And sometimes the surface looks difficult while the deeper structure is quietly building something. This is why a decade can feel confusing from the inside. You might be in a fundamentally strong chapter, but the surface layer is rough, so it does not feel like a good decade until you step back and look at what was actually constructed during those years. This is the part that surprises most people when they first encounter the decade system. Take two people, same year of birth, similar chart structure, similar elemental profile. You might assume their decades would track together closely, that if one person's 30s are strong, the other person's 30s would be strong too. They often are not. And the reason is the direction of the decade sequence. Every year in the Chinese calendar has a polarity. It is either a yang year or a yin year. That polarity, combined with your gender, determines the direction your decade sequence runs. For some people, the decades count forward through the calendar. For others, they count backward. This means two people born in the same year, even the same month, can carry entirely different elemental energies through their decades. One person might reach their most favorable elemental chapter in their late 20s. The other might not encounter that same quality of energy until their mid-40s. Same birth year, different timing, completely different experience of when life opens up. And this is exactly why you cannot read a person's future from their birth chart alone. The chart tells you what is structurally possible. The decades tell you when the conditions align to make it real. People often ask why two friends born around the same time can have such different trajectories, different rates of progress, different ages when things started to click. The decade sequence is almost always part of the answer. Every chart has a set of elements that support it. The Day Master, which is the central character in your BaZi chart, the one that represents you, has elements that strengthen it and elements that weaken it. The specific mix depends on your chart as a whole, but the principle is consistent. Some elements are favorable for your chart, others are not. When a luck decade brings one of those favorable elements into your life, it functions like a rising tide. The potential that was already sitting in your birth chart, quietly present but not yet activated, suddenly has the conditions it needs to move. The wealth structure that was always there begins to generate. The career path that made sense on paper starts producing real results. The relationship energy in your chart attracts the right circumstances at the right time. You are not doing more. The elemental conditions are simply cooperating with what your chart is already built for. When a luck decade brings an element that works against your chart, the experience is different, not always dramatic, more like friction. Things that should be straightforward require more effort than they should. Progress that would normally compound starts to stall. There is often a persistent sense that you are working harder than the results justify. Neither of these is permanent. That is the critical point. A difficult decade ends. The next chapter begins. And if that chapter brings better elemental conditions, the experience shifts again, completely. This is why BaZi practitioners are consistent about one message. Your current experience is not the complete picture, it is one chapter, and chapters end. The decade does not operate in isolation, it is always in conversation with the birth chart. And those two forces, the fixed natal energy and the incoming decade energy, interact in one of three broad ways. The first is harmony. The decade element aligns with your chart, it supports your day master, it amplifies the structures already present in your birth pillars. This is what most people are describing when they look back on a particular decade of their life and say things simply worked. Decisions that would have been risky landed, people who helped them arrived at the right time. Opportunities that had been unavailable suddenly became accessible. It was not always easy, but there was a quality of things clicking into place that was unmistakable. The second is pressure. The decade element clashes with something significant in the birth chart, a direct opposition, a collision of forces. This tends to create visible tension in the area of life that corresponds to the clashing position. If the clash hits the position linked to career, that is where the friction concentrates. If it hits the position linked to relationships, that is where instability surfaces. Clashing decades are not always completely negative. Sometimes the pressure forces a necessary change, a restructuring that would not have happened without it, but they are rarely comfortable, and they usually cause more energy than a harmonious decade would. The third is transformation. This is the most nuanced category. Some decade elements do not simply support or oppose, they combine with the elements already present in the birth chart to create something new. The incoming energy changes the nature of what is already there. A particular element that was functioning in a certain role in your chart gets altered by the decade energy and begins functioning differently. This can be strongly positive. It can also be destabilizing, depending on what is being transformed and what it becomes. Reading a transformation decade well requires understanding not just the decade itself, but what it is interacting with specifically. I want to be direct about something. Knowing your decade is not an instruction to stop working. It is not permission to wait until conditions improve before you attempt anything. That is not how this system is meant to be used, and practitioners who frame it that way are doing their clients a disservice. What the decade system gives you is orientation. In a decade where your chart's wealth structure is activated, the probability of financial progress is genuinely higher. That is not a guarantee. Nothing in BaZi is a guarantee, but it is a real signal. If there was ever a time to be more decisive, to move on the right opportunity rather than hesitating, to push harder in the direction that already has structural support, a favorable wealth decade is that time. In a decade where the energy is working against a particular area of life, the system is telling you something equally useful, not to give up, but to recognize that the cost of forcing that area is currently higher than it needs to be. Sometimes the most intelligent move is to build in the areas that are open during this chapter and let the more difficult area settle until the conditions shift. This is the practical value of the decade system, not prediction, orientation. You are not reading your chart to know exactly what will happen. You are reading it to understand where you are currently standing, because where you are standing determines what the most intelligent next move actually is, and that changes depending on which chapter you are in. The same action, taken in the right decade, produces one result. Taken in the wrong decade, it produces another. The effort is identical, the outcome is not. That is not superstition. That is timing. The luck decade is the dominant frame. It is the chapter. But within every chapter, there are smaller fluctuations. Each calendar year brings its own elemental energy into the picture, and each month adds another layer on top of that. These shorter cycles do not override the decade, they operate within it. A favorable decade does not mean that every single year inside it will feel equally smooth. There will be stronger years and quieter years within any chapter. Equally, a difficult decade does not mean that every year inside it is a struggle. There can be genuinely productive years within a harder chapter, moments where the annual energy lifts things temporarily. The way to think about it is layers. The decade is the background, the annual year is the foreground, the month is the texture of day-to-day experience. Most people who read horoscopes or annual forecasts are only ever looking at the foreground. They are completely missing the background. And without the background, the foreground often makes very little sense. You might have a year that all the annual forecasts call favorable, but you are in a difficult decade. The year does better than the surrounding years, but it is still operating within a harder overall chapter. Or you might have a year that looks difficult on paper, but your decade is strong. The annual friction is real, but the structural foundation underneath it holds. Reading both together, the decade and the year, is how you get an accurate picture of what any given period is actually doing. The decade system is one of those parts of BaZi that permanently changes how you read everything else once you understand it. It answers the question people are always really asking when they look at their chart, not who am I, but when does this change? When do the conditions finally align? When does the difficulty ease and what comes after it? The answer is almost always in a chapter you have not looked at yet. Next time, we are breaking down how to know if you are in your luck phase right now, and why most people cannot tell even when they are already in it. If you want to catch that when it drops, subscribe on YouTube. That is where every full episode goes first, and that next episode is the one that changes how you read your current chapter entirely. If you spend more time on TikTok than YouTube, everything goes there as well. Full videos. Find me at mrshu_metaphysics. And if this episode gave you something useful, a like helps more people find this kind of content. That is the only reason I ask for it. I am Mr. Shu. I will see you in the next one.